as we become more expert in steering the vehicle that is our brain, that will take us on this grand adventure that is our lives, it's important that we just sort of pop the hood and have a little look underneath. Once again, here in the Geek Spot, the aim is not to create cognitive neuroscientists, but people who have advanced brain driving skills. This lesson we looked specifically at the amygdala, the lower pathway, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. This time round, we're going to look a little bit deeper, and we're going to just get a bit of geography on the brain so we can map our way or find our way around it a bit better. The first thing to know is that the front of the head and the back of the head do not correlate with the front and back of the brain. So very basically, the brain starts off as a little T cell thing going there. The top of the T turns into the brain, and the foot of the T or the leg of the T becomes the brainstem. And the way it works very basically is that as the brain grows, it doesn't expand outward. So this is the front of the brain, and that's the back of the brain. So as the brain grows, it expands upwards and around and collapses in on itself. So you can see that the front of the brain and the back of the brain are quite close to one another. So this would be the front of the head and the back of the head, but the front and back of the brain are down there in the midbrain, quite close to one another. So when we talk about the prefrontal cortex, it sits behind the forehead, but it's not the front, it's before the front. So that is more or less what we're talking about. The brain is also separated into a forebrain, a midbrain, and a hindbrain. And then it's also separated in the more familiar thing that we have with the lower brain, the instinctive brain, the mammalian or emotional brain, and then the new brain, the neocortex, or the rational and intellectual brain. But we are in this particular course concerned really with this particular midbrain part of the brain. So last lesson we learned about the bodyguard, and that he is in charge of things, works very quickly, and has a very limited emotional spectrum. So we're going to add some things to this. So when the information comes up the brainstem to the amygdala doesn't work alone. It works connection with the hippocampus. Now the hippocampus is directly above the brainstem, the pons, and of course all of these organs have twins because you've got a left and a right brain hemisphere as well. So the hippocampus goes all the way around and it sort of comes in. And of course the amygdala also has its twin, which goes around to the other side of the brain as well. So when the information comes in, it goes to the hippocampus, and what the hippocampus does, it creates, stores, and retrieves memory. So I'm calling the hippocampus the librarian of the brain. So we're going down here. The librarian. And if you left these two to their own devices, they'd create this little fear-filled echo chamber. The amygdala says, what's fearful? And the librarian will just go out and find every fearful memory. And it'll go, you don't want to do that. So these two guys together work on the lower pathway. But when we start adding other characters, now the next character I'm going to add is I'm going to add the thalamus. So the thalamus sits sort of in the middle of your brain, which is a very appropriate spot for it, because the thalamus I'm going to call the receptionist. So the thalamus is the receptionist. It's the reception. It's where all the information that manages to get past these two guys goes to the thalamus. Remember the stop exercise? What you're doing is you're sending information to the thalamus, and the thalamus then distributes the information to the various organs that need to have it in order that we have a more considered, a more nuanced emotional response. The next character on our list is, I'm going to make him purple, the royal purple. The next character on our list is here, the previously mentioned prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex, the CEO, the Chief Executive Officer. This is the part of the brain that correlates all the information, takes an objective overview, and then produces a considered response. It is the thing that plans ahead, looks to the history, plans ahead, makes some adjustments, and then sends the information back down into the body so that we can react in a more beneficial, more appropriate way, as opposed to this highly reactionary way that the amygdala produces. Now, all of these characters send their orders to another character. Now, what color shall I make him? Let's make him blue. To another character. And this character is called the hypothalamic nuclei. The hypothalamic nuclei, which sits over there, and he has a sort of a direct link to the amygdala. And what the hypothalamic nuclei does, it receives information from the various parts, various brain organs, and it produces, in response to that, it produces neurotransmitters, hormones, and it triggers the start of this hormonal endocrine nervous system reaction that allows us to have emotions and to have actions that are based on the emotions. So we're going to call him the bartender, the cocktail mixer. He mixes the shots that allow everybody to act in a certain way. So there you have the basic characters in the brain that you will learn to control to a certain degree. If you calm down, certain things will happen in your brain. I'm going to, while I'm here, add two more aspects of the brain. In orange, we're going to add, these are organs in the brain. So these are specific organs. The prefrontal cortex is a cell cluster, and then just between the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex is another cell cluster. So let's make them fuzzy, which is the nucleus accumbens. That's your party animal. It's a cell cluster. And then down here, in the lower part of the brain, the lower, is another cell cluster, which is where your these are the basic areas of the brain that we will consider. Let's just see. So, these are the basic characters. Now, on your diagram, you can follow along and fill this in. My downloads are very specifically intended for you to print them out, because in doing what I'm doing here, I am adding a layer to my brain's ability to learn. Our brain has a very particular learning cycle, which we will go into once in the next few lessons. And the more parts of the body we use physically to learn, the stronger, more quickly, more efficiently the brain does learn. And our fine motor senses are a very powerful learning tool. Writing is more powerful than swiping when it comes to learning. Much more powerful. Swiping doesn't teach us much, but writing. establishes the information in our intellectual, in our body, in our motor cortex. So the idea really is for you to write down what you're learning and also to write down what you're feeling, not just to sort of remember it. Write it down in the logs. Right, so these are the characters that we will be dealing with in the next few lessons. You don't have to get to know them any more than you need to know where the spark plugs are, but you do need to know about them so that you understand that when something is happening to your body, some emotion, there is something happening in your brain. And that is the important connection that you want to make this week. The body and the brain are working together in order to create an emotion which results in an action. And what we want to learn to do is to steer our emotions to beneficial, purposeful action.